Welcome to Democrats Live. This is Tom Perez, chair of the Democratic National Committee, coming to you from the Democratic National Committee headquarters here in Washington, D.C. We are streaming at live.democrats.org, where people can also go to sign up to take action and donate. You know, I usually talk about the Democratic Party, what we need to do, and we had a show planned this week to do just that. But sometimes you get overtaken by events. And this is one of those weeks. This isn't a show about the Democratic Party. This isn't a show today about democracy, because events of the last 72 hours involving the termination of Director Comey and how it was carried out, and the continuing unfolding events that appear to me, at least, to involve potential obstruction of justice and other affronts to our democracy, caused us to really take a step back and say, we need to talk about this. And we need to talk about it with one of the premier and preeminent ethicists in the United States. And so I'm very proud to have as our guest today, Norm Eisen. Norm's middle name is ethics. Norm, when I was working on the Obama campaign, was the ethics advisor to the campaign. Norm was the one who gave us ethics training. Norm was the one who delivered news to everyone about the fact that there were very important rules that you needed to follow, and Norm was relentless about that. He founded, in 2003, he co-founded a group, a government ethics watchdog group. In 2009, President Obama appointed Norm to be the special counsel for ethics and government reform in the White House. And after that, Ambassador Eisen was then appointed ambassador to the Czech Republic. And he didn't check his ethics at the door when he got to the Czech Republic, because that was an important part of what he did then. And so today we're going to talk about this. And by way of background, I talked about Norm, but I must start out, Norm, by saying something about my own experience. This show and this topic is very personal to me, because I had the privilege of spending 14 years at the Department of Justice. It's a department whose name talks about what its goal is, what its job is, what its aspiration, and its aspiration must always be the reality: justice in fact and justice in perception. And I had the privilege of serving as a career prosecutor during the Bush 1 administration and during the beginning of the Clinton administration. Roughly half my tenure was a career civil servant at the Justice Department, and I'm proud to say that. Independence was our currency, and independence is always the currency of the Department of Justice. The darkest days of the Department of Justice during the Watergate era were the days in which you saw presidential interference in the workings of the department. President Obama was vigilant about retaining and maintaining the independence of the Department of Justice, and one of the people who worked hard to ensure that vigilance was Ambassador Eisen. You know, we're in a weird world when the Nixon Library is tweeting information, as they did this week, distancing itself from the actions of President Trump. And that is exactly what happened. And so I want to say good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're listening today. And I want to say good day to Ambassador Eisen. It's a pleasure to have you on this program.
Thank you for having me, Tom. I'm delighted to be here and very pleased to talk about these subjects. I wish we had other occasions to be here, because it is a crisis for our nation, for our democracy, and for the world because of the United States leadership role.
Let's just review what happened this week for our listeners. Very unexpectedly, there was an announcement that President Trump had sent a letter. Well, I think Director Comey was in Los Angeles visiting FBI agents, and he received a letter informing him that he was fired. The first explanation was that the reason for the firing was that they had apparently mistreated Hillary Clinton during the campaign, which I will resist the temptation to simply laugh, because that doesn't pass the laugh test. And the reason, and as a result of not passing the laugh test, the explanations evolved. The second explanation was they were simply following a recommendation of the Department of Justice. That recommendation we will discuss today. But that recommendation or that explanation then evolved when Donald Trump did an interview with Lester Holt, in which he said, I was going to do this all along, no matter what the recommendation of the Department of Justice. And one of the senior advisors or spokespeople to the president said, well, he decided Tuesday to make this decision to fire Director Comey. Well, the president himself said, I was going to fire him all along, regardless of what that recommendation was. And then this morning, we see a tweet from the president that says, Director Comey better hope that there are no tapes of our conversation. I used to prosecute obstruction of justice cases. I still remember the title of the code. I think it's 18 U.S.C. section 1512 and 1503. I prosecuted law enforcement officers for intimidating witnesses. I prosecuted police chiefs for doing this. When I read something like that in the context of investigations and prosecutions I have brought, that doesn't pass the smell test for me. So let me start out by asking you, do you think is this a crisis approaching a constitutional crisis?
Well, I do think that we're in a crisis. We're on the precipice of a constitutional crisis. We typically hit a constitutional crisis, Tom, when, as in Watergate, it appears that the one of the branches of government is defying the legitimate instructions of another. So you may remember President Nixon refused to comply with some of the congressional subpoenas in congressional requests for information, including relating to his tapes in the Watergate crisis. That was one of the aspects of the constitutional crisis. The tension here is one between President Trump's behavior and our constitutional values. Because by firing Comey in the way he did, with the pretextual excuses, which you point out one by one have fallen by the wayside, he's attacking the most precious idea of America, which is that no person is above the law. And essentially what
I've heard the Attorney General say that no person is above the law.
Yes.
And he might want to remind himself of the fact that he said that in connection with, I think, President Clinton.
So that's the clash here, and we have yet to see. We will see if the other branches of government rise. All of the branches of government, including Trump's own executive branch, they all took an oath to the Constitution. And those who are now investigating President Trump's involvement, if any, those of the people around him, if any, his campaign with Russia and its attack on our democracy, will that investigation be allowed to proceed? Will those law enforcement officials be allowed to do their job? So I do think we're at a moment of great constitutional peril.
Let me go right to some of the questions that we're getting on Twitter and Facebook. And I want to go to a question I got from Troy on Facebook, because this is a question that I get when I do a lot of news interviews, and I suspect you do as well. And his question is, why did Democrats want Comey to resign and be fired back in October last year, and now they're upset that President Trump actually fired Comey? And I'll note, just to add to Troy's question, I have certainly been critical of the actions that Director Comey took last October. As someone who worked at the Justice Department, I thought those actions were unprecedented, and I continue to feel that way, and I feel strongly about that. I feel equally strongly that President Trump's actions this week threaten our democracy, and so to the extent that you have a similar view, how do you respond then to Troy's question?
Well, I also felt that Director Comey did not make every choice in the absolute best way, but nobody who felt that way is endorsing President Trump's effort to shut down the investigation of Russia's attack on our democracy, or endorsing President Trump lying about the reasons for the firing. So I think that the fact that you disagreed with Comey's previous decisions doesn't mean you need to embrace the obstruction of the Russia investigation or the lying of President Trump. And somebody put it nicely on Twitter. They said, just because I disagree with the decisions of the Supreme Court, it doesn't mean I want to see all the justices of the Supreme Court fired. This is really an attack on the functioning of our democracy and the independence of our law enforcement, and so and it's wrong.
There have been many. I hate to use the word laughable because this is no laughing matter, but when I heard the first explanation, and I sometimes flip on Fox News because I want to understand what people whose worldview is quite different than mine are saying. And when they were saying with a straight face that Mr. Comey was fired for mishandling the Hillary investigation, I could not help but flash back to the praise that was foisted upon Director Comey by Fox News, by then candidate Trump, when this happened. And now suddenly I feel like Rick at Rick's Cafe in Casablanca. Suddenly they are shocked that Mr. Comey was engaged in some wrongdoing during the course of the presidential campaign vis-a-vis Hillary Clinton.
Well, the proper cinematic analogy may actually be to the Godfather movies, Tom, because you'll remember that Trump kissed Comey. He gave him a kiss at the law enforcement reception at the White House. And then, to continue with the Godfather analogy, Don Corleone Trump, he demanded at a private dinner, he then demanded Comey's loyalty. And that's what's so troubling. This scandal came to a tipping point for me last night when the loyalty demand, which Trump denies, the loyalty demand was written about in the New York Times at the private dinner. Because there you really do have something. You could say, is it obstruction of justice or not for the president to exercise his authority, which he has under the Constitution, to fire Comey? But when you learn that President Trump had demanded Comey's loyalty, and Comey declined, according to the New York Times story. Again, Trump denies it. And then there's a pattern that culminates in the firing. That does start to raise much more serious obstruction questions. So it feels a little bit more like The Godfather or The Sopranos at this point.
I call that a friendly amendment. Let's go to another question from, this one is from Twitter. Because I hear this one a lot when I'm traveling, or I hear variants of this. And the question is this: why is it illegal to talk to the Russians? I'm having trouble understanding this scandal. Explain it to me like I'm 5 years old.
I will try to explain it as I would as a dad, like you. I'm a dad, as right. I would to a family member. And by the way, I should add that I'm here in my personal capacity, not in my watchdog chair capacity, not in my think tank capacity, the other hats that I wear. But I'll answer that question, as I'm answering all of these, in my personal capacity. You ought to care about the allegations about Russia because it was an attack on our democracy. And it's going to happen again if we don't do something about it. It affected the outcome of an election, but you ought to care about Donald Trump's foreign ties for another reason. Take China. How can we trust Trump and his family members, his daughter and his son-in-law are his two top advisors sitting there. They all have China ties, current or past China ties. Donald Trump getting an enormous trademark that was denied him for years. Suddenly, as he approaches the White House, the Chinese give him this extremely valuable trademark. They gave 3 trademarks to his daughter as she was the same day that she was sitting with her father and the president of China. If The Trump family is getting these enormously valuable inducements from other countries. Can we really trust them to stop the flow of American jobs that are going abroad? Can we really trust them to put America's interest first, as they say they're doing? So it's going to cost Americans, I think, the foreign financial ties. We don't know what they are on Russia because Donald Trump won't provide his taxes. They're going to cost Americans jobs, prosperity, maybe put American lives at risk, as in the North Korea crisis. Can we trust Donald Trump that he's really going to say to China, crack down on North Korea? That's why these foreign ties matter, Tom.
Well, I recall candidate Trump saying, on day one, I will label China a currency manipulator. What subsequently happened on the issue of currency manipulation? That's called a softball question.
Nothing happened because Donald Trump, it's not just the currency manipulation. He started his transition, Tom, saying, I am going to overturn the one China policy that has guided American engagement, recognizing China for decades, and I'm going to do more with Taiwan. Well, guess what? These trademarks started to flow to him and his family. Goodbye, Taiwan. He embraced the one China policy. There's been no labeling of China as a currency manipulator. I think it's outrageous. I think it's against the Constitution. The Constitution says presidents are not allowed to accept cash or other benefits from foreign governments, so-called emoluments clause. Emoluments, just a fancy 18th century word for swag. Okay, presidents can't take it. It's a violation of the Constitution. Donald Trump is doing that. That's why I and others have brought litigation to ask the courts to order him. Stop it.
You talk about the issue of, let's bring it back to Russia for a moment and connect the dots, because I hear from people in my travels, Norm, that, this Russia thing, I don't really, come on. What's going on? I'm just worried about making sure my kids have access to quality education. I want to get a good job. This seems like a distraction. Why should the American people continue to be concerned about this?
Well, there was an attack on our democracy. Let's remember what happened, Tom. There can be no doubt that the Russian hacking and leaking and other illegal cyber war actions during the campaign were an effort to intrude on our democracy. The intelligence agencies have unanimously found that Russia attacked our elections and that they did so with the intent to favor Donald Trump. That voting that happens in our democracy is the foundation of everything else. That's how the Americans express who they want in office, the policies they want to have. If we don't do something about it, if we don't let the FBI conduct their investigation, and they're asking the most serious question of all, which is whether the Trump campaign colluded with Russia in this attack on our democracy, the Russians will attack our democracy again. We'll lose faith in the outcomes of our system. So we have to allow this to proceed. And at the core of it, and this sometimes gets lost because it's a scandal a day, we still don't know the motives for Donald Trump's bizarre embrace of Russia. Why did he stand up and invite Mr. Putin to hack Hillary Clinton's emails? Why was he so slow to admit the Russian involvement? The part of the reason we don't know that is because we don't have his taxes, so we can't see whether or not there were Russian financial ties. But we know his sons have alluded to him. There's no doubt Donald Trump Jr. said they see a lot of Russian money flowing into their businesses. There's a controversy now about Eric Trump saying to a journalist that they had a $100 million Russian line of credit for their golf courses during the time of the financial crisis. So there's a lot of questions. I'm not saying we know the answers. Maybe it's just smoke, but we must have those taxes as part of the inquiry. We can't lose sight of that.
I was always taught as a prosecutor that your job is to do justice. Justice is a search for the truth. And when you have people who say, better hope there are no tapes of our conversation, when you have the investigator who has been asking for more money for this investigation, we now know, who went to the appropriate committees in the House and answered questions about the fact that, yes, we're looking at this, and yes, we're looking at the interactions of the Trump campaign and the Russians. Yes, we are continuing to do this, and yes, this is serious. I can't help but wonder. We need to watch that show, the movie with Jack Nicholson. You can't handle the truth, and Tom Cruise, because the American people need to know the truth. And I've said with frequency, wake up and smell the cover up here. And what I recall from the Watergate era was that over time, there were Republicans who understood that this is bigger than party. This is about our democracy. This is about, and I started this program saying this isn't about the Democratic Party today. This is about our democracy. And I'm not seeing, I see Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell, marching in lockstep with this president, refusing to support the appointment of an independent prosecutor, refusing to support the establishment of a 9/11 type independent commission. I mean, thank God France had those media blackouts in place. And thank God the Russians were stupid because they didn't realize that they needed to do it earlier, or else they would have done it earlier. And when this is happening to our allies, and we have a sock in our mouth, so we don't help our allies, and France has been there for us since the founding of this nation. And we can't be there for them now when there's an attack on their democracy. I don't know what else we need to say to support the creation of an independent counsel. So my question for you is, what do we do to get Republicans to put country over party? Because history has its eyes on them, and it will not judge them well. Do they want to be the John Ehrlichmans or the H.R. Haldemans, or do they want to be, folks who, in this time of really moral and economic and constitutional crisis, rose above the prevailing winds?
Howard Baker in the case of Watergate. Well, I do think that the events of this week will represent a tipping point or an inflection point in the effort to get a bipartisan response to the president's misconduct. Number one, you have to remember, Tom, of course you know this, the two of us are of a similar vintage, so we remember watching the news. It took the Republicans 6 years to break with Nixon. There were allegations of Nixonian illegality from the get-go. It took a very long time for the erosion of the partisanship, and I now have occasion to look back at the Watergate history. Nixon had defenders. When the articles of impeachment were moved in the House, there were many Republican congressional defenders who said this is wrong. They will stand up for the president. Despite that, there was a critical mass, and we're starting to see some cracks in the red wall protecting Trump. I'll give you one example, an encouraging one. One of the responses to the Comey firing was a subpoena that issued, a bipartisan subpoena out of the Senate Intelligence Committee from Senator Warner, the Democrat, and Senator Burr, the Republican. I know them both. They're both fine men. Subpoenaing information from General Flynn. Okay, so that subpoena spoke volumes. You saw Mr. Chaffetz, who sometimes has been criticized. I've at times been frustrated. He's the chairman of the House Oversight Committee, together with ranking member Cummings, who's been a terrific champion on these issues. Mr. Chaffetz sent a letter to the Inspector General of the Department of Justice saying we have to look at the Comey firing. So we're starting to see some cracks in that red wall. I do think there's a core of Senate Republicans who will come along. But it's not going to be easy because, as you've pointed out, the leadership has taken a very protective posture towards President Trump. Now, we'll see if this tweet, when you describe the statutes at the beginning of the show, don't forget 18 U.S.C. 1502, obstruction of justice. I think there's now a very serious question. Now that we know there was the dinner with Mr. Comey in which President Trump demanded loyalty, Comey allegedly wouldn't provide it, according to the New York Times. Trump denies it. And then that set off a series of events that culminated in the firing. 18 U.S.C. 1502, is that obstruction? And then the tweet this morning threatening Comey, as you say, 18 U.S.C. 1505, is that witness intimidation.
Better hope there are no tapes of our conversation.
1512.
1512.
Yeah. 18 U.S.C. 1512.
I prosecuted a police officer, and his father-in-law was the police chief.
Yes.
And he was engaged in serial misconduct, and the police chief, his father-in-law, said that anyone who testifies in front of the grand jury will be fired, and if you appeal that, I'll fire you again. And you know what? They had a lot of time in jail to reflect on their misdeeds.
And some folks, myself included, are grappling with the question of Trump's undoubted constitutional right to fire Comey. But there is also case law saying if you wrongly exercise a legal right in order to obstruct an investigation, that can be a grounds for 18 U.S.C. 1505 for those of your viewers who are out there looking. 1505 is the obstruction statute, and 1512 is the witness intimidation.
You can fire people for stupid reasons, but you can't fire people for illegal reasons. And if you are, you can't fire someone because of the color of their skin. That's an illegal reason. And you can't fire someone if your purpose is to intimidate them. And when you see these bogus explanations of why someone is fired, and when you see a DOJ memo that comes from an attorney general who was purportedly recused from all things Russia, but how could you not have spoken about Russia when you were preparing that memo is beyond me.
I wasn't ready because of the president's strong hiring and firing powers for an FBI director, and Director Comey himself has written the president can hire or fire for any reason. I wasn't ready to talk obstruction until the stories broke about Trump's private loyalty demand to Comey. As for that was the tipping point for me, that this smells like he really is. And, we'll need to have an argument. We need more evidence. There is a very troubling aspect that you've hit, and I was involved in calling for the recusal as an ethics matter of the Attorney General. If you're involved in a campaign under the DOJ's own ethics rules, and there can be no doubt that Attorney General Sessions was deeply involved in the Trump campaign, you can't then participate in an investigation relating to the campaign. He agreed to a very broad recusal of anything any investigation relating to that campaign. And now he, under apparent pressure from the president, has stepped in and gotten involved with the firing, which we heard on national television the president say was related to the Russian investigation. So I don't know how that's not a violation of the recusal agreement. It's very troubling, could have serious ethics consequences for the Attorney General.
Well, when we came in the beginning of the Obama administration, there were a lot of pieces to pick up in the aftermath of Attorney General Gonzalez. I saw that firsthand when I was there. I'm proud of the work that Eric Holder and others did to restore justice at the Department of Justice. And I can't help but observe history repeating itself, perhaps in different ways. And as, again, as someone who has a great loyalty to that department as a result of 14 years of experience, it is why I have such passion about this issue. because we need to get to the bottom of this. This is about the search for the truth, and we have a president who doesn't want the American people to know the truth. And so one of my remaining questions I want to ask you, I'm thinking about what our listeners are thinking right now. And you mentioned it took a number of years for the evolution in the Watergate scandal to become a bipartisan cacophony against Richard Nixon. How do we make sure that doesn't happen here? What can our listeners do to make sure that they are having their voice heard?
Well, first of all, I want to reassure you that there is ample bipartisan support for an investigation of the Trump campaigns and possibly Mr. Trump's own connection to Russia and to the Russian attacks on our democracy. Most of the work that I do together with the Bush-era ethics czar, with Professor Painter. So, and there are many other Republicans who have spoken up, not as many as I would like in positions of authority in the Congress. I think in terms of what we can do to continue to drive that is we need to focus, as you have focused today, not on the partisan issues, but on our democracy. We need to focus on the facts. The president does not like the truth. We need to be extra truthful. We need to be careful not to go down to his level, as tempting as it may be, Tom. We need to take the high road. That means we're going to have to work twice as hard. And that's part of the reason I wanted to come on the show today. As you said, OBE, it was that we called an audible, because we need to get the message out about the facts and the truth. What is the law? And eventually, I think if we keep hammering at that, we will be able to make sure that justice is done. It's important to note that large majorities of Americans do care about the issues here. For example, President Trump's tax returns. We need to see those tax returns to know if there are or are not Russia ties. Somewhere between 70 and 80% of Americans, including many, and in some polls most Trump voters, want to see those tax returns. So I think there are public majorities that we can build on, and the leadership will follow where their voters take them. So that's the strategy. Focus on the truth, keep hammering away, bring the public along, and the leaders will follow.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing here at the DNC. And for listeners today, we urge you to contact your representative and demand an independent investigation. And you can go to makecalls.democrats.org/Russia. And here's what we're demanding. We're demanding the appointment of an independent prosecutor to look at this, because we need to know the truth. And we have seen from this Justice Department that they are incapable, and I say that with profound sadness. They are incapable. They have been compromised. They are incapable of doing this investigation in a fair and impartial manner. And it's not only the pursuit of justice, it's the appearance of justice that is equally important, and they have compromised that. So we need to call for that independent counsel to be appointed. We need to call for a 9/11 type commission to be appointed. The 9/11 type commission was a critically important moment in our nation's history, where we understood what went wrong, where we understood the consequences, where we understood what we need to do differently and better to make our nation safer. We need to demand, thirdly, that if you're going to do tax reform, a condition of tax reform is going to be the release of Donald Trump's taxes. Because you know what? You may have a question about, you may be wondering, if you're out there in Middle America, and I've spoken to so many people in Middle America who say, I'm just concerned about my children's well-being and my economic well-being, and I share that concern. But when you have a president who's using the presidency as a lost leader for his business enterprises, which is what is happening, and he denies it, but we're incapable of understanding the precise extent of his business engagements in Russia, China, and elsewhere, because he has stonewalled unlike any president in modern American history. We have seen tax returns from candidates. And the reason it's relevant, as the ambassador correctly pointed out, is because we need to know whether we're compromised. The day after this firing, he is hosting the Soviet foreign minister along with his sidekick, who was the person who met Jeff Sessions at the Republican National Committee. I can't help but wonder whether he timed it so that he would have a deliverable for this meeting.
Shocking. Those
That is
pictures are
unconscionable.
shocking.
And the pictures are not only shocking, but the fact that the only media allowed in the room was the Russian media. This bromance between this president and Putin, we've got to understand what's going on, because our national security is at risk. Our democracy is at risk. Our economic security is at risk. We need to know, did he tell China, oh, you're not a currency manipulator after all, because he got these remarkable benefits for his business, benefits that they had denied him for a number of years until now he's the president. So that's why we need folks to get involved. That's why we did this show. And again, I invite you to contact your representatives and demand the independent investigation, demand the 9/11 Commission, demand legislation requiring this president to disclose his taxes, and ask Republicans, why don't you want his taxes to be disclosed? What the heck are you afraid of? Do that. MakeCalls.democrats.org/Russia. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you for your excellent questions. And we will see you next time on Democrats Live. And it's 10:11.
Thanks, Tom.